Hi everybody, I'm Toa Fraser. I'm a filmmaker. I live in New Zealand. I studied at Auckland University with Roger Horrocks. We're going to take you on a journey. We're going to go through early beginnings of my career in the New Zealand industry, working with greats like Alan Guilford, Leon Nabi, Tim White. Eventually, we're going to go on a rambling journey throughout the ages, but at some point we're going to come back here and touch on this incredible project which I was lucky to work on the last few years, Sweet Tooth. Yes, always a storyteller, I guess. Living in the English countryside, sort of out of place a little bit over there, given that my dad was from Fiji. My mum also had a great story. She was from Essex, a very conservative family there, and obviously kind of mixed race marriage in England in those times was, not uncommon, but it was definitely a thing. So she was very brave as well. She really wanted to get out of her lifestyle. I guess when she was 18, she went to work at the BBC as well as a sound technician. I grew up there. We eventually moved to New Zealand. It was a culture shock, very much. I wanted to come at that time. I remember I was 14, really couldn't wait to get out of England, but also imagined something slightly different, I think, here. I remember arriving at the airport and seeing like basically a whole place. I'm related to everybody in there. I had a very large family. My dad had 12 brothers and sisters, and they each had significantly large families themselves. Ours was kind of the smallest, I guess. It was a bit of a culture shock, as I say, but then playing rugby and finding my place with all my cousins, it was a very beautiful time after that. I started writing. I mean, I was writing, but really my first journal on the shelf over there was when I was 15 in the backyard of Mount Roskill and State House there on the corner of Beagle Ave and O'Donnell Ave. Very profound time, actually, if I think back on that. I was also doing an acting course with Michael Hurst at the time. It was one of the first things I did here. Incredible, like 5-day-long thing or something. It was quite brief, it was a summer thing. And then I'd go to the Mark One bookshop, read a whole bunch of comics. In the back of that comic, there was a page of letters to the editor, and one of the letters was, are there any great comic writing handbooks? And whoever the editor was at the time said, no, there's not, but there are a few great screenwriting books. This was 1990, I should say. And I went to the Auckland City Library, found that particular book, and started writing from there. When I came to New Zealand at 14, I'd been at high school. And that process and the process of falling in love with New Zealand really made me want to write those plays, I guess. And from that sort of celebration of people from all walks of life in New Zealand, that real diverse melting pot, as I said before, of the movies, but also of my family. It was, I found after having grown up in the countryside in England, pretty much just me and my brother and sister, and occasionally getting glimpses of what New Zealand might be like when my family, cousins might come to visit, but that was always very brief. The one constant visitor, I would say constant, but quite regular visitor, was Alan Guilford, the great New Zealand cinematographer who was a friend of my dad's, and he always used to come, and we used to think, well, what a rock and roll guy he is, because he can just show up in England whenever he likes, and it was like he really lived that kind of rock and roll lifestyle. The rumor was that he always used to drive, before I knew him in New Zealand, the rumor was that he used to drive around in a Jag with 2 cases of champagne in the boot. And I don't know if that story's true. Anyway, by the time we came back to New Zealand, he was still a great friend, and he used to invite me to film sets, and he was a great mentor for me. I remember going to the film set. First film set I ever went on, I think, was Silverdale Rugby Club when they were making Old Scores, the movie about the All Blacks losing, I think, to Wales in the 60s or 70s or something like that. Having said that, there's really no worse place to be in the whole world than on a film set when you don't really have anything to do. So I loved it, but didn't love it that much. I wanted to start working as quick as I could. So having said that, Al did get me a job working on a film set eventually in the electrical department on a music video. I can't remember who it was, but it was in a warehouse in Ponsonby. And my job was to go up and put blacks over the skylights on the roof with sandbags, and that was quite a good job for a teenager, I thought. Went up there, and then at the end of the day I had to bring it all back down, so I went up and in my naivety I thought I'll just throw that sandbag over the edge. And as soon as it left my hand, I can remember going, that's going to explode on the ground, and yeah, it exploded. But I don't think anybody saw, but don't do that. That was my first lesson. When I was writing plays, I always feel like I kind of fell into that part kind of by accident, but in the end it was my real kind of golden ticket way in to making movies. But you know, all my biggest influences growing up were movies, so I always wanted to do that. And indeed, SPP optioned Bear kind of like the same week that it was on. You know, at the time it was amazing, but having said that, I also realized quite quickly that I was wanting to direct movies myself, so that was kind of a big impetus to write number 2. And I remember writing 2, you know, I always say I wrote it for 2 women, Madeline Sami, obviously, but also my grandmother, Lola Marjorie Fraser. It took a long time to find the right people to get that movie made. Eventually, Lydia Livingston from Sydney, who was a producer, and number 2, and Tim White, who's still a great friend of mine, they came on board. I wrote a lot of drafts during that time, and there was one draft that he thought was particularly bad, so he made me rewrite it within 24 hours. I called that the Jerry Collins draft because it was like just needing to smash it out, and that was actually ended up being the draft that we went out with. So at that time I was like, yeah, man, that's pretty amazing. First movie, let's go to Sundance. Won a great little award there, and then the rest is not quite how I imagined, but very fulfilling nonetheless. One thing about being a playwright was the sense of ownership, and not only creative ownership, but also economic ownership. I don't talk much about money, but it was incredible to, you know, do this thing, and they were relatively successful for a, you know, 23, 24-year-old. And to be able to get an income from writing at that age was pretty incredible. So that was one thing. It was also amazing to get my stories in front of an audience for 90 minutes. Learned a hell of a lot about audience, where things are boring, when, you know, I didn't do any short films, I didn't do really any music clips before I directed a feature, but I had done a whole bunch of, well, 2 plays that had been of length, that I had sat in the audience all around the world and learned a lot about audience. Actually learned that my uncle is usually the only one that goes to the toilet in the middle of a performance. And that carried on into my filmmaking career as well. Yeah. So doing that, it was in a neighborhood, an environment that I felt very responsible to, but also very safe in. And I felt like I was kind of inviting all these filmmakers into my neighborhood, really. It was my family's neighborhood. My auntie and uncle, Albert and Claire Fraser, they lived literally just around the corner of Freeland Avenue, and we shot on Roseman Ave. Phil Ivey, production designer, who's gone on to great, amazing things since, including all those action movies with Chris Hemsworth and all of this kind of stuff. But he and I went for a scout. He stood on the top of Mount Roskill, pointed directly to that house and said, "That's the one we want." And very kindly, the Tongan family that was living there at the time, they were supportive. They moved out for a little while we made our movie. Ruby D blessed us by coming from New York to play the matriarch of a Fijian family. At the time, she had never been away from her husband, Ozzie Davis, for as long as she was going to be on this shoot. Little did she know at the time, nor anybody else, that when she left and arrived in Auckland 24 hours later, Ozzie Davis died. And that was this moment of, I remember Tim White calling me in the morning and saying, you know, we're going to have to fold the movie because Ozzie Davis died last night. And at the time, I was, on the one hand, you know, really disappointed that the movie's potentially never going to get made, but also just kind of really grateful to be having been a small part of this incredible history, I guess. I went to see Ms. D down at the hotel in Auckland where she was staying. I walked in and she said, "They dimmed the lights on Broadway for my husband last night, Toa." And, you know, again, grateful for that. She went back to the funeral. And then she came back 2 weeks later, and when she left, I remember her saying, you know, this time we didn't know whether or not the movie was going to get made, but she, you know, she may have just gone and stayed there, but she said, "I'm looking forward to coming back and celebrating life with you." And that's what she did, came back and blessed us. So she was, you know, if you have to make a movie with an American movie star as your first movie, make it with Ruby D, right? And also Leon Nabi, one of New Zealand's legends of cinematography, and a legendary man, great friend and mentor. He was initially, didn't really know what kind of direction I wanted to take number 2 in, but then I showed him all the sort of, I guess, sort of the fancy, lush Visconti references that I was thinking of. Largely because those sort of, you know, Nana Maria in the play, she talks about wanting like a Italian feast like they have in the Dolmio commercials. So I wanted to make it like very clean and pristine and lush. Golden, I guess, and Leon responded to that really well. He loved that. Took a long time to find the right editor for some reason. I can't remember why. I talked to a lot of people, but then I saw In My Father's Den, Brad McGann's beautiful movie that Chris Plummer cut, and again, you know, it's just really clear to me that Chris had to be the editor for number 2, so I was grateful that he came on board. And another one, Don McGlashan, who did the music. You know, I was really surrounded by these incredible practitioners, not only, you know, at the head of department, but also, you know, throughout the crew. Peter O'Toole, like people always, I mean, obviously people always ask, how was it directing Peter O'Toole? Was it scary and all that? But I didn't find it scary at all I don't know why, I've tried to think about it over the years, but it was kind of like, if you're going to do this, you want to do it. If you want to climb this mountain, you want to top of the mountain. So you want Peter O'Toole on your side doing that. When we were working together, he fired a couple of shots across the bow to the production before I had even met him about costume and stuff. And he's like, the director has to come over to my place, we're going to talk about it, and he's got to bring the wardrobe designer and we're going to have a big conversation. So I went over to his house. We had a little bit of a conversation about wardrobe. It lasted about 2 minutes, and then we started talking about rugby and the All Blacks and cricket and stuff like that. And from that moment on, I think he was just kind of trying to suss me out, you know. From that moment on, he was on my side. He said it very clearly in the production. "Are you all right, mate? Do you need anything? Don't forget, I'm on your side." Pretty cool. The third day working with him, he called me into his green room first thing in the morning, and obviously the whole crew's like, oh, what's happening? Director's got to go in O'Toole's dressing room. So I went in there. He was on a seat not unlike this. I went in and said, I'm 31, 32 at the time, very naive. I went in and said, good morning, Mr. O'Toole, how are you today? He said, I'm just reading about my mate Norman. I was like, oh yeah, how's he? He threw his newspaper down on the thing. He's dead. It was Norman Mailer. He stood up and put his hands on my shoulders and he said, Toa, I'm going to teach you something that David Lean taught me. And I'm like, okay. And he said, look into my eyes. What do you see? I don't know, Mr. O'Toole. Courage, generosity. Picked up another magazine, showed me a picture of a model, like a Vogue model or something. Look into her eyes. What do you see? And I said, I don't know. He said, light. You see light. Light the actor's eyes, they will love you for it. So from then on, I asked Leon I told Leon that story, and he organized a special little LED panel for Mr. O'Toole's eyes, his very famous eyes. My advice would be don't talk too much. That's basically how my directing has evolved, I guess, over the years. And with actors these days, I really don't do much rehearsal. I say, we do it. I did a few scene-specific rehearsals on Sweet Tooth, but not very many at all. Really like to get the actors on the set, send everybody away, have a very brief rehearsal, and as I say, don't talk too much. Try to do some physical activity as part of line reading. Something very, depending on who it is, it could be something very athletic or something very basic, like just swinging your arms around. Try to not do everything up in here, but try to do it in your body a lot more. And then gradually block it as efficiently and as well as you can. And then I always bring everybody in, show everybody like a little theatre piece. And at the end of that, I always do a round of applause. So I always say, let's have a round of applause. And you do this in America, like on a cop show like The Rookie, everybody. First you do that and everybody's like, why are you doing that? But then everybody starts realizing, wow, it's kind of a cathartic spirit thing. But also, it is kind of based on the Pacific sense of tapu and noa. So I always think that rehearsal's kind of sacred time. And then you come in, you show everybody that's a campfire, some moment where everybody's, wow, that's the story. Okay, awesome. Let's draw the curtain on that, send a team away, bring in stand-ins ideally, which is one thing that we don't have quite so much on New Zealand sets, but then you get the tools out and start making it. The first thing that motivates what project I take on next usually is money. And, people say, how have you made those choices? And I don't really feel like I've made choices much. A little facetious or falsely modest again, but, I remember reading Robert Altman saying the same thing. It's like everybody asking him, how did you choose to do Popeye or something? Or whatever, and he's like, I've just done the projects that I've been able to do, and it hasn't been like this massive grand plan about strategy or anything. Just gone from one thing to the next. I guess with the writing, I'm always confident that I can go back to that if there's times when I'm not directing. But in terms of the diversity, that really comes from inside of me, coming from background that I have, Pacific family, English family coming together, lots of different people across my generation and our family, very, very diverse. Christmas time in New Zealand, first time I ever saw that, it was like very, very diverse. And there's always also that Walt Whitman thing of, do I contradict myself? Something like, I'm large, I contain multitudes. My philosophy on working is keep working. You know, regardless of where you are, what you're doing, whatever. Tell the stories that are speaking to you, I guess, at the start. It's really important. But also don't be afraid of those independent, sorry, not necessarily independent, but don't be afraid of those stories that seem not to come from you, but when you begin working on them, you realize, holy shit, this is totally coming from my soul. Sweet Tooth, for example, like it's based on a graphic novel by Jeff Lemire. And it's about this kid who's a hybrid, and a hybrid like he's part deer. And on the face of it, you think, it's a cartoon and a comic, you know, I'm not going to necessarily relate to anything in that. But when you start working on these things, you realize what soulful, you don't know what you know. That's what I always think. And I'm just, you know, you asked about choices and how I've made the choices that I have, and I respond by saying, you know, I just basically made it about money because I want to get paid. But that's not really the truth, I guess. I think I just feel like I'm here, and if there's all these stories floating around in the world, and if one of them wants to come through me, and then that's cool. I'll do my best to apply myself to that process and let the story speak. River Queen was kind of out of the box experience. I was too young really to work on that, to write that. Vincent Ward, he had been, you know, all around the world. He had his incredible career in Hollywood. Came back to New Zealand looking for a writer. I guess I was the playwright of the moment. And, you know, I remember sitting in the lounge in Wellington. We were living in Wellington at the time. I answered the phone, the landline, and he said, Toa, it's Vincent Ward here. Like, I should know who he is. And luckily I did, because if I didn't, it would have been like, oh yeah, who's this? And he was this very, very hard-working, obsessive, I was going to say, but you buy into those stereotypes of people, but actually at the end of the day, those stories aren't necessarily true. But the truth of the matter was that he was knocking on my door at 6 a.m. when I was in my 20s and not really up for that particular kind of work process. And I regret, I guess, the fact that I didn't, I didn't know how to approach that movie, partly because I wasn't Maori. I didn't know how to represent a Maori story. I wanted to make it in a kind of, if I had been doing it, I mean, I wouldn't have done that, but at the time I was writing very contemporary stuff, so it was like my first historical thing. I didn't really know how to get into that either. So Vincent would come and sit at my house at 6 o'clock in the morning at the dining room table reading Empire magazine, and I'd be in the room trying to make the screenplay work. And then we got a good draft, or a couple of good drafts together, and then the rest is history with that movie. And I ended up seeing it and really loving it, and Alan Bollinger obviously was a big part of that as well. Learning, a lot of learning curves on that one. Have I written anything for any other direction? I'm not sure if I have since then. I remember when I talked about Giselle, when I was promoting that, you know, after number 2 in Dean Spanley, very beautiful movies, but very talky, you know. And I had said that I wanted to do something more athletic, and Giselle ended up being that thing. And Giselle led to the Deadlands, also very athletic, where Giselle was ballet, Deadlands was mode arco. So we knew that it was going to be a physical thing, and I knew that I was going to have to approach it as a director more physically than I directed anything before, not just the way that we moved the camera, but also myself, how I represented my own physicality, especially with a lot of men, a lot of athletic men, also a lot of soulful work that I wanted to be able to get the actors into without having to talk about it too much and get very heady on it. So when we cast Lawrence Makawade, which was just an incredible thing in itself, he committed to 4 weeks training with Josh Randall, who I'd never met before, but he became a mentor for me and a really great friend over the last few years as well. Lawrence took it pretty well when we said, okay, you're going to have 4 weeks in the Batcave with Lawrence, and then you have 6 weeks. So that's in advance of prep, and you have another 6 weeks after that of getting in shape. And the day before he started training, I called Josh and I said, do you mind if I come to support Lawrence on his first day with you tomorrow? And Josh said, yes, sure, but bring your sneakers because there's no spectators at my gym. So I embarked on 4 weeks of very intense training, of the kind of training I hadn't ever really done before with Lawrence. You know, partly as a commitment to Lawrence himself, but also I didn't realize at the time why it felt so important to do it as a commitment to myself as well. But I wanted, I guess, to prove to myself that I could handle the physicality that was going to be important for me directing a movie like that. Little did I know at the time, but the symptoms of Parkinson's were getting quite strong. And indeed, it was only really 18 months maybe after that that I got diagnosed. But I've said to Josh that, you know, I felt like that training at the time gave me at least another couple of years of normality before the Parkinson's symptoms really began to bite. One of the interesting things about that particular disease is that it's not so bad now because I had DBS brain surgery earlier this year, but it's the little things like this that Parkinson's really affects. I'm doing this voluntarily, but at the time, you know, I couldn't really. So little things like that, your handwriting gets really small, your voice gets smaller, but you can still lift heavy weights. It's really weird. So the part of your brain that is able to do the big lifting and all that stuff, it doesn't really affect it at all. So that was a very important lesson for me to learn, that at the time I didn't have to be diminished by this condition as long as I managed to keep pumping iron. I sort of half laughed there because I was going to do an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression, but then I remember that James Cameron would just disapprove, as he did indeed at the screening in Los Angeles of The Deadlands that he hosted. And at the beginning of the screening, I said, you know, this is a great dream for me because as a teenager, we used to do Arnold Schwarzenegger impressions. And he said, no, I'll be the judge of that. Don't do that. Yeah. Well, the first thing that I have learned is to say no a lot. And I read somewhere, probably on Instagram or something like that, and it's something that I really believe, is like, if it's not a fuck yeah, say no. And that's not just about choices in the movie industry, but choices at home, you know, parties and stuff like that. You know, I say no most of the time. James Cameron gave me some health advice. I asked him for some health advice, just didn't know about diagnosis, but he gave me a few things in the lead up to 6 days, because obviously he's plant-based diet and healthy man himself. So he gave me his green smoothie recipe, which I didn't do that so much on Sweet Tooth, but when I'm overseas, I always make myself a green smoothie in the morning. Very important. Wrap on time, again. Now, you don't know what's going on for anybody, but I think if that's the time that we've agreed to do it with, then we should stick to that and send everybody home. And therefore they can rest and recuperate as much as they can after a 12 or 14-hour day, whatever it is. I guess also, you know, the other thing to say is that I get a lot of energy from working with really great people. And I have been very lucky that I have been able to do that and continue doing that, especially on Sweet Tooth, being in New Zealand, but also working with such a great team of New Zealanders, but also Americans, in showrunner Jim Mickle especially, that they were very supportive of me. I mean, it's a cliche probably to say to that generation where you've got these tools in your phone so that, you can make a movie. And you see a lot of people doing that already. But, when I started when I was 12, right, so I was making this little James Bond movie, and I'd record the whatever footage they were using on TV at the time to promote The Living Daylights, the Timothy Dalton movie. First Timothy Dalton James Bond movie. I'd record that on the VHS, and then I'd borrow a VHS camera from my friend who's a teacher at community college or whatever, and so I'd shoot myself playing James Bond, and then I'd get two VCRs, connect them up, and edit them together that way. It's kind of like a very fiddly and long-winded process, whereas that kind of thing you can do on your phone, like now, as you know, you can do it on your phone. So why am I telling you that story? I guess I was telling you that story because I wanted to tell you the Penny Dreadful story. So I'm in France after making 6 days, and my manager calls and he says, John Logan wants to talk to you about directing an episode of Penny Dreadful. John Logan, right, he wrote Gladiator, he also wrote Skyfall, he wrote all these incredible things. Also, in Penny Dreadful, Timothy Dalton's in that. And obviously when I was 12, I had cut him out of his own first James Bond movie and cut myself into it. So looking forward to meeting Timothy Dalton. Also, Ava Green's on it. So naturally, I'm going to do that show. Went to Ireland to make that. One day, I'm walking out of my office upstairs. Timothy Dalton's downstairs waiting for his car. I was going to go down and get a car myself, but Timothy Dalton's down there. I felt too shy, so I went back into my office and closed the door and waited for him to go home. That's the end of my James Bond story. And it's the end of my James Bond career, no doubt. I think I said it before, but I feel like it's something I've only very recently learned, that letting go as much as having a clear kaupapa or a clear mandate, or I guess, when I started, I wanted to be this guy and I want to do it like this and I want to control stuff a lot more. But over the years, I've learned that really the process of doing it is way more fulfilling than the result. And, I really learned that on number 2. And so this whole time in my 20s and 30s, I'm dreaming of hitting Sundance and getting a pre-sale with Miramax and all that stuff, and getting an award at Sundance, and then going on to bigger and better things like those filmmakers that we looked at in the 90s, Tarantino and all those guys did. But, so therefore, I mentioned it to you before, therefore I was expecting these amazing, great things when number 2 hit the big screen, and I followed it all around the world, going to all these parties and stuff. But really, what I learned at that time was just keep working and keep telling stories, regardless of whether that's on the stage or on the screen or indeed as comic books, whatever. So this is something that I've only very, very recently learned for myself, is to let go a lot more. And as I said, I feel like, if there are stories out there and if I'm the right one to tell them, they'll come. If I'm not, they'll go to somebody else. I think the best thing that I did for my craft was give up a little. And by that I mean, as I said before, you don't, figure out what you can control and what you can't, and what you can't control, forget about it. At the start, as I said, I was like, no, I want to control this, I want to control it. And it's all got to come from me, and it's got to bang, 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 smash it out, whereas now I feel a lot more relaxed about where the next project's coming from, stories that I might have the opportunity to tell. If I don't get the opportunity to tell any more stories, that's cool. Maybe somebody else will do it. I'll just go and grow my tomatoes or whatever. I feel very lucky and very fortunate to have worked with some incredible people, told some incredible stories, and looking forward to doing that as long as I can, or as long as I'm able to contribute something worthwhile.